All right, hi everybody. Thanks to those of you tuning in for this. My name is Richard Jones and I'm a master's student at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. And today I'll be briefly talking about some exploratory work done earlier this year with Christoph, a colleague at University of Klagenfurt, where we looked into applying a concept called Bayesian surprise to NILM. First, I think probably everybody has an intuitive idea of what surprise is. But to make it more quantitative, let's say you're living as a good Bayesian with various models of the world built up by many observations and related beliefs. And say your model of the world in which aliens don't exist, or maybe they do, but they're not little green men walking on Earth, has a high credence in your mind. And then all of a sudden you see one. This observation can have a huge impact on your commitment to your previous model of the world. Say you trust your observation. It wasn't Halloween and there were no serious drugs involved, so the posterior update to this model results in a distribution very different from your prior. The divergence, often the KL divergence, between this before and after observing a little green man is what we refer to as Bayesian surprise. The original motivation for this work was to be able to keep models in deployment flexible by monitoring incoming data for novel appliance activations, as well as for the case of unsupervised methods, where you may need to build up distributions first for later inference. And knowing when you have enough information for this later inference is pretty important for those types of methods. Second, we wanted to see if too much similar data from a given house can lead to overfitting in NILM models. And although many regularization techniques exist to avoid this, it's still a major challenge to generalization. Finally, if we did find this to be the case, it would change the way we use existing data sets as well as how we collect new ones, potentially saving significant time and resources collecting excessive data from single sources. So just to outline the rest of the talk, I'll discuss two metrics for Bayesian surprise used in this work, postdictive and transitional surprise. I'll give a quick example of some results that suggested a potentially useful surprise threshold to truncate a given training set. I'll then show some preliminary results hinting at some regularization benefits of this surprise threshold. Excuse me. And then finally I'll motivate the use of this transitional surprise using a popular super state hidden Markov model, which was developed by Stefan McConan and others. So the idea of postdictive surprise is to examine how the predictive likelihood changes as new observations are being made. Now, ideally, this would be done without reference to a particular NILM method that may presuppose some learning structure. Arguably, the most straightforward way to monitor novelty in the aggregate in a sort of data intrinsic way is to cluster on the first differences. So for this reason, a non-parametric Gaussian mixture model is constructed on the absolute differences in the aggregate. And non-parametric modeling is necessary since it allows a flexible state space, which can expand and contract the number of necessary components as required by the data. Now, naive clustering on the raw data is difficult due to transient behavior and its relationship with sampling rate. So we first passed the data through what we call a steady state filter, which we developed in 2019. This allows a consistent representation of appliance activations, which makes clustering far more accurate and reliable. So the predictive likelihood in these models can be approximated under the variational inference framework as expectations of the mixture weights and component-specific likelihoods under the mean field variational distribution given by Q. And just for reference, I've put it here. I won't go into too much detail about it though. The non-parametric form of the GMM is handled by these pi objects, the mixture weights, which are generated as needed from what's called the GEM or stick breaking distribution. The proportion of the remaining probability stick here is sampled off according to a beta distribution. So the postdictive surprise is then calculated as a divergence between the predictive likelihood before and after the observation of some window of events of length W. The divergence used in this work is the Jensen-Shannon divergence, but again, the KL divergence is probably the most ubiquitous. So the instantiation of new components in the GMM certainly qualifies as surprising, but the relationships between components can also change and converge to some relatively stationary form. So for this reason, we looked at the surprise associated with these transitions, which we call transitional surprise. And this is calculated as the sum over the divergences between each row in the transition matrix before and after observing a window of W events. Each element of the transition matrix indicates the probability of transition from the row index state to the column index state. So each row accounts for all transitions out of a given state, including self-transitions. So we looked at how some of the more popular benchmark methods supported by NILM-TK perform when trained on varying surprise-based subsets of a full refit house of training data. So clearly there's some saturation of algorithm performance here with respect to dataset size, and the approximate point of plateau in this and two other refit homes suggested a joint surprise threshold shown here for a given patient's row. So for this patient's parameter, once the joint threshold is met, row determines how many windows we wait for another one which exceeds the threshold. So the surprise values here are normalized to their maxima. So this threshold can be interpreted as, we should stop when the postdictive surprise is less than 1% of its maximum, while at the same time the transitional surprise is less than 50% of its maximum. So yeah, these values are obviously somewhat arbitrary and not validated very generally as of yet, but hopefully we can tighten those up in the future. So using this joint surprise threshold, we looked at how these algorithms perform on an unseen house when trained with the full house 3 and the surprise-based subset. As you can see, all but one method showed better generalization to house 5 with the cutoff training set. And clearly this is a small case study, but it seems promising and we think it warrants some further study. To look into the usefulness of this idea of transitional surprise, we used the popular HMM method and checked the effectiveness measure, which is just 1 minus the F1 score, and averaged it over 7 appliances in the Ray dataset using various surprise thresholds. The decay rate of the effectiveness measure follows pretty closely the decay of the transitional surprise, and the plateau in performance occurs long after the postdictive surprise had converged. Now the differences in decay rate can be explained away by how the dynamics are encoded in the superstate context rather than component to component transitions. But the indication here is that the crude approximation to the system dynamics might provide a useful overestimate of how much data is necessary to learn state correlations. So just to quickly summarize, this preliminary work showed some evidence of model performance prediction by using data intrinsic notions of postdictive and transitional surprise. Surprise-based truncation of a refit house used for training showed better generalization to an unseen house than using the full training set. And finally, the use of transitional surprise was validated at least in a Markovian setting. Left to future work is the refinement of the surprise threshold and further verification that it's actually predictive of model performance. And if it turns out that it is even weakly predictive, this could be very useful for model exploration and really expedite NILM research and dataset acquisition. Second, exploring the use of Bayesian surprise as a regularization method is probably the most exciting application, so that's definitely worth exploring further, especially in the cross dataset context. And finally, appliance states that appear similar after filtering could be segregated by submodeling their transient behavior. And then the Bayesian surprise associated with these submodel parameterizations as new activations are observed could allow for things like fault detection as well. Thanks for your time, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take those. Thanks.